This book is different from other corporate governance books on the market in that it's really evidence-driven. The way we structured the book is around facts and evidence. So what we do with each section is we start with an idea, we explain how it works and what the positives and the negatives are of different approaches to governance, and then we look at the data on how prevalent certain things are out there in the market, and we follow it up with academic research that tests whether these things are positive or negative, and we draw our conclusions from that. A lot of the books that are on the market today are really opinion-based, so they start with a central premise, and then the author spends the majority of the book defending why that premise is correct. A lot of it is based on that person's opinions and in some cases biases, but they're not really evidence-driven, and in many cases those conclusions may or may not be true, but they're not really tested. I think the most surprising finding from the book is that a lot of the focus is misdirected in governance today. A lot of the attention is placed on features of governance. So for example, what's the structure of the board of directors? How much compensation is paid to CEOs? And things like that. And a lot less attention is paid on the factors that really matter. And these are the processes by which the company actually makes decisions. So for example, a lot less attention is paid to the strategy and risk management functions, and those are areas where boards can really stand to improve. Another area where boards can stand to improve is with CEO succession. A lot of CEO succession planning within corporations was shown to be a more check-the-box solution and not really what we expected. We expected that companies would have operational plans in place, things that they could do if the CEO suddenly stepped down and they needed to find somebody right away. And I think going forward, a lot can improve with a new focus on the features and of how governance is run rather than just these superficial factors.
I think the most surprising finding of the research is that how little impact the research has actually had on practice. There's tons of academic research across accounting, finance, economics, corporate strategy, and things like that. Lots of careful thought, but I don't think that research has had that much impact in the way people actually think about it. You know, the blue ribbon panels that are filled with clearly well-known people, very smart, very successful. When you read their reports, there's actually not much discussion of the research that either supports or doesn't support some of the findings. I think one of the things that we hope the book does is provides a synthesis of the research in a digestible form that the press, directors, lawyers, government regulators and the like can actually see that there is a body of work out there that informs. You don't have to do it yourself. It's already being done as part of the scholarship in universities. So we're actually a little surprised how little impact it sort of had in these things. Other kind of more practical things that we found surprising are the inability of boards to actually put in operational succession plans. This is really a key part of risk management. And it's a pretty serious part of what boards do. I mean, ultimately, they evaluate and vet the strategy of the organization. They kind of hire and fire the top management. And so, one of the two issues seems to be lacking a little bit. The boards are struggling with lots of things with regard to CEO pay. Now, that's not that surprising in and of itself, but the SEC has recently required boards to talk about are the pay practices motivating managers to do excessive risk-taking. That sounds like something the board ought to evaluate, but I think we don't really know at this point, how do you define excessive risk-taking? What would it look like? And then the issue is, how can you evaluate that? And so we actually have some proposals or, sort of hopefully informed guesses about new ways to think about pay. How much incentive are you really providing? And when are you in a situation where you start worrying about excessive risk-taking? One of the examples that we have in the book has to do with Eli Lilly, and they went through and did a very detailed assessment of excessive risk-taking, and their response was to basically take out lots of the incentive contracts. They got rid of stock options. They capped off bonuses and things like that. Now, That may be fine for Eli Lilly, but you kind of wonder about what happens if a lot of companies did that. I mean, it's the incentives that actually drive the innovation that really motivates people. And I think taking these things out is not necessarily a good result for shareholders. It may mitigate risk, but it may substantially reduce the returns for companies as well.
We employed a very rigorous and methodical methodology, and it took a long time to do that. I mean, this book was almost 3 years in the making. And with each feature in governance, we went through and collected all of the literature, both from academics and professionals. We looked at the data that was available, and we looked through the popular press to find examples of things that companies are specifically doing in these areas. And we also added interviews that we conducted with third-party experts, consultants, lawyers, and practitioners, including directors and executives. And we took all that information and digested it together in a way that we believe gives the most comprehensive look at all areas of governance.
In the media, shareholder discussions and things like that, I think there's lots of things that are missing. First off, I think people are trying to do the right thing. You want to highlight and penalize people where they've had bad governance and are doing kind of bad things. So I think that's a good thing. The issue is, what mechanism do you want to use to isolate the ones that are the good ones from the bad ones? I think what's missing is everybody, or most people out there are really trying to find, here's a very, very simple yardstick for measuring corporate governance. Do you have this many directors of this type? Or is the pay of this form? Things like that. But I think the problem is it's a lot more complicated than that. There are certain differences in organizations and people, corporate strategies and things like that that basically make a simple yardstick a place to start, but not a place to end up. You have to think more carefully about what are the choices, and it's not a one-size-fits-all set of choices for evaluating corporate governance. Boards face lots of sensitive issues, and the issues that are really sensitive are vary over time. In the 1990s, 2000, early 2000s, we had lots of audit failures. So the board was very concerned about, is the audit function appropriate? Do we have sufficient internal controls? The audit committee of the board was under tremendous scrutiny. I think now what you see is that the compensation committee is the committee, and the decisions that they're making are the ones under tremendous scrutiny. Is the CEO paid too high? Are we paying the people the right form? And there's lots of people on the outside, both media, but also proxy advisory firms that are weighing in on this. And it actually now is going to shareholder vote through the so-called say on pay. So I'd say that's a tremendously sensitive issue for the board. The other issues that are sensitive are risk management. Do we actually know what's going to happen if we have some sort of hiccup in either the inputs or the outputs of the firm? If you have an earthquake in Japan, how does it affect whether they're going to be able to get our raw material? Do we have plans in place and things like that? What happens to us if all of a sudden interest rates go up or we lose a major customer? What is our strategy capable of dealing with that? So lots of boards are trying to deal with risk management, and one key part of it that we've seen certainly around the country recently is succession planning. Do they actually have somebody that's going to plug in? Do we know who that person is? How comfortable do we feel about that as we replace management? I think what's going to happen going forward is, I think the next committee of the board is the Nominating and Governance Committee. There's tremendous scrutiny now about, do we have sufficient diversity on boards? Do we have the right board members? The people that come up for evaluation for new board memberships or actually come up through the Nominating and Governance Committee. So how that committee operates, are they doing the right thing? Are they picking the right people? Those kind of things I think are clearly on the horizon. The book has lots of important takeaways. One of them is that I think you want to be very cautious following blue ribbon panel recommendations or things that you read in the press or what are presumed to be best practices. And when we look at these things in the book from a research perspective, a lot of these things just don't hold up. Some of them are clearly fine, but some of them not. So I think the book really lays it out in a pretty neutral way and gets in there and says, what do we actually know about things like should the CEO and the chairman of the board be separated? What do we know about how you should structure pay and things like that? But I think the primary message of the book is you have to think a little harder about governance choices. You just can't follow these standard recommendations. Yeah, in terms of pressing developments, the thing we worry about is, for lack of a better term, the federalization of corporate governance. We certainly have seen Sarbanes-Oxley go into place. It was directed mostly at the accounting function and other features of the board. But more recently, the Dodd-Frank bill, which has been passed in some form, although is being litigated, really opens up the board to lots of inquiries that are basically imposed on them by the government. So one of the things is they're opening up proxy access under the rubric of shareholder democracy. So if you're a shareholder, you ought to be able to vote, in America and have some impact on these things with regard to directors that are elected and things like that. One of the proposals is if you've owned 3%, you or a group have collectively owned 3% of the company for 3 years, you can nominate 25% of the board for election. So instead of having elections where they're mostly uncontested, except in proxy contests, you have a situation here where the outsiders can bring board members forward for potential election to the board. Now, that's something that's being imposed on the companies. That's not something they would do necessarily of their free will. And you kind of wonder, is that a good consequence or not? Basically, we've actually done a little research around this. We find that those kind of proposals seem to be greeted with big negative stock price responses for companies that look like they're going to be subject to these criteria. So there's a case where the government has, in some sense, decided that's a good idea, have kind of passed this thing, but the research results are suggesting maybe it's not such a good idea. So hopefully, the research like that will inform regulators in the government, what might be a good thing to do. But I think right now in the administration, there's a lot of interest in, imposing governance criteria on companies that really could have been voluntarily adopted and weren't. And the trillion-dollar question is that good or not? Is it better to have regulation, or is it better to let the market operate? Of course, that's the age-old question in economics, and I think here's a case where I think we can weigh in a little bit on this. But I think the federalization of corporate governance is a big